I want to do two things tonight before we go to 1 Kings, and both of them have to do with one kind of with a life perspective, and the second has to do with both our study and our teaching. And I'm in a class with Everett Hufford, and he had read a lot from a man, and he called him Bobby Clinton. His technical name is Richard. And he had had a career and had done a lot of different things earlier, but just became absorbed and interested in the leaders in the Bible, those who led. And when you just look at the numbers, there are about 1,000 people throughout Scripture who lead in some capacity or another. But the comment was, he said, there's about 100 of them that we have some details about, and then we know quite a bit about 49 of them. But here's the question above the line, and I want you just to kind of think about this for a second. Of the leaders that we know things about, what percentage of the leaders in the Bible finished well? Say what? Yeah, and just kind of file that away, because he's exactly on target. And part of what we're doing tonight as we go through and looking at Solomon is he listed 4 different categories of those who led, and we'll talk a little bit more about these in a second, but I just want to introduce these 4. And he said there were some who got started and cut off early. And like one of the ones that I put on the list was Jonathan. You know, makes a good start, but he's killed when he's fairly young. The last really, really good king in Judah was named Joash. And the king of Egypt is going up to fight the Assyrians, and for whatever reason, Joash goes out to stop him from doing that. And the last of really the good kings gets killed when he's very, very young. And so one group of leaders, he just used the term, they died young. They got cut off early. A second group of leaders are those who finished, but they finished poorly. And we'll look at, again, some comments about that as some things, but just think about that. Yes, and they'd be very much kind of in the middle, but you look at that, and they are going to finish, and I would put even David in this category, because of the personal sin in their life, they finished, but there were always these questions about that. Then there were some who, and let me just rephrase that. Those who finished poorly, I would rephrase that, and we're going to put Solomon in this group. You know, he has such a good start. His father is the man after God's own heart, and over a period of time as we go through this, his life is virtually a decline of spirituality to the point that we come to the very end, and it hurts to kind of read a passage like this. He's not a teenager, he's not in his 20s, but when he is old, his wives turn his heart away from God. And so he never lived up to the spiritual potential that he had. The next group were those who finished so-so. And there'll be a category for these. And then there's those who finish strong. So if you have the outline, turn it over to the back. And if you look at the back page, while we won't be able to read all of these, here are just kind of some samples. And the reason I wanted to do this is that we're looking primarily biographically at the items that lead up to Solomon's life. But the question I want to kind of start with, and then I want to kind of come back to the end, is just to say, and just for myself and for yourself, which one of these 4 are going to describe you and I? And you look at these different categories, and this is something for us to consider. I always hear this passage from Romans 15 and verse 4. It kind of echoes in my mind. Whatsoever things are written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. And one of the things that I think is important for us to learn, and do you want to use the word case study? Do you want to use the term biography, looking at different characters and things? And it's one thing to look at them and say, yes, this is what happened in their life, but to me, then the question becomes, okay, for you and I, of these 4 different characteristics of how people finished, what will be said about you and I? Most of the people in here, thankfully, are not cut off early just because of our age. And so we've, because of chronology, have lived over a longer period of time. But when you look at those who finished poorly, and that was the expression, in some ways they were going downhill the latter part of their ministry, and he suggested Gideon, Samson, Eli, and then when you look at the next 2, of the 3 kings of the United Kingdom, Saul and Solomon are both in this category. And that also tells us something about kind of that period of time in Israel's history in terms of their leaders. Those who finished so-so, they did fairly well, but they were limited, either because of choices that they made. We have David, Jehoshaphat. Hezekiah is the one where every time I read this, I just kind of shake my head. God sends the prophet to him and says, you're going to die, get your house in order. And Hezekiah repents, turns to the wall, and prays to God. God sends the prophet back and says, okay, I've heard your prayer, and I'm going to give you an additional 15 years. And you stop and think. None of us know, most of the time, how long we're going to live. We had a wonderful guy at Eastside who, the first part of his career, he investigated plane crashes. And that'd be hard. Going on site where planes had crashed and looking at the damage and all this other stuff. So he did that for years. Worked at Tinkerfield some, and then for years he was the sheriff for Eastern Oklahoma County. So he just had a very, very diverse life. And he was 75, went to the doctor, and the doctor said, Hartman, you have prostate cancer. And he said, well, what are the options? And here's this big hunk of a man. He says, well, you could do this, and this would happen, do this, and here's these side effects. Hartman said, what happens if we don't do anything? He said, well, this is low grade, and you'll probably live about 15 years. And Hartman said, well, 90's about right. Let's don't do anything. He lived to be 92. And like I said, most of us don't have some kind of an indicator for that. But how would you live your life if you knew that you had 15 years to live? The tragedy is he has the 15 years, and when he dies, his son is 12 years old, and he's virtually a certified pagan. And you stop and think, okay, what are you thinking in that if you know you only have 15 years to live, how much time should you be investing in this next generation? And he chose not to do that. And so that's in the category of finishing so-so. Those who finished well, and I love this expression, they were walking with God at the end of their life. And as Scripture opens and Moses talks about these early characters that we meet in the Bible, one of those expressions that's used a lot is that, Noah walked with God. Abraham walked with God. And literally, God's going to say, yes, let's count the stars. Yes, let's talk about the sands of the sea. But Abraham, I want you to walk the length and the breadth of this land, and wherever the sole of your foot goes, I'm going to give this land to you. He literally walked with God, and this is the characteristic of those who finished well. That relationship with God carried them through all kinds of different trials and temptations and other things, and these were the people who finished well. And one of the expressions that we use, go ahead. Yes. And you have times where even the imagination of people's hearts is evil continually. And as we said, people like Enoch walk with God, and what a wonderful commendation. I'm just going to list these 6. We could do a whole lot more on these, but I just wanted you to be thinking about this, and while we're looking at Solomon, to be looking at to say, okay, what's God going to say about me? Where am I going to fit in terms of these categories? Very quickly, 6 characteristics. They maintained a personal and vibrant relationship with God right up to the end of their life. This is even hard to say. On 2 different occasions, I've gone to people in their 80s who were nearly home, and they just gave up. And I'm sorry, you just wanted to shake them and say, you're nearly there. Don't quit. And it's just kind of like they just kind of wore out and kind of gave up. We leave those people in God's hands, but you look at the people who finish strong, and I like to think of it this way. Solomon's whole life is going to be an incline downward, and those who finish strong in one way or another, they're still growing in their walk and their relationship with God all the way through. In prison, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the course. Therefore, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. And it didn't matter what the physical circumstances were, chains or prison, Paul's relationship with God was going like this when he finishes, and that was a characteristic of those who finish strong. 2, they maintain a learning posture.
Paul didn't start out that way.
No, he didn't. And the contrast between Saul and Paul is enormous. It's huge. They maintain a learning posture and could learn from various kinds of life experiences. They evidence Christ's likeness and character, our New Testament people. The fruit of the Spirit was in their lives. Truth is lived out, and the conviction and the promises are seen as real. And they make some type of spiritual contribution. And again, you just think of Paul. How many churches did he start? How many people did he encourage? How many people did he teach? I'm confident he probably wrote other letters that we don't have, but he wasn't just a spectator, he was a participant in the items of faith. And then number 6, they walk with a growing sense of destiny and see it filled in some form or another. So back on the first page, as people looked at the leaders of the Bible, just fewer than 30% of them finished well. So let me say the same thing in a different way. 2/3, 2 out of 3 of the leaders in the Bible did not finish in that category of having finished well. Now, I don't think that's a prescription. I don't think that that's, necessarily a formula for all time, but something to learn from. And that's something that just I think about a lot and gives me a lot of things to pause and to think about. We're going to do one other thing before we start looking at Solomon, and we'll do this quickly. I have 3 lines, and these start from the bottom and go up. And especially studying the Old Testament. 1, as we're going to do with 1 Kings 1 through 11, you can go through and study the material biographically. You can look at the individual. You can look at the person and the things that take place. And like, for example, we're here in the book of Judges. Oh, every man did what was right in his own eyes. Or when I'm reading through the later Kings and I hear, oh, he was not like his father David. In my mind, I go, dun, 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 this is not going to be good. Or if you hear, oh, he was like his father David, that tells you a lot. And so I tend to think, both as we do classes and as we teach, as we study, the bottom level is biographical. The second level, we can come back and look and see what is God doing in terms of forming a people and forming a nation. And so where we are with Solomon is that the first 2 kings are anointed by Samuel. And as we said earlier, if you want to find about Saul, he's in 1 Samuel. And then he also anoints David in 2 Samuel. And the 12 tribes are going to split in 1 Kings 12. And so our information about Solomon is going to be in that particular area. And so what is God doing in developing a people? And in the Old Testament, he is going to be developing a nation. In the New Testament, he's going to be developing a church, a body, a temple, a bride. and a number of other terms. But still, God is always in the process of building a group of people. And so, bottom, biographical, second, national, and then we can come back through the same material and just say spiritually, what does this tell us about God? And that's the one that we can't do too much of, because I think from beginning to end, God is the main character of the Bible, and he reveals himself as he walks and works and deals with the different people and the characters that we find out about. So when we look at actually 1st and 2nd Kings, in the Hebrew Bible, they're just one book. It's just the book of Kings. The Hebrew Bible, there's 22 books, but it's not 1st and 2nd Samuel, it's just Samuel. It's not 1st and 2nd Kings, it's just Kings, and it's Chronicles. So in our English Bible, that's how they're divided out into 39. But one of the things to notice is that when we're reading a book, what is the last datable event that takes place in the book? And quick example in the book of Ruth, Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father, well, it goes Boaz, Obed, Jesse, and then we hear about David. So either the book or that event, and while you're going to go back 4 generations, is going to be written down during the time of David. When you read 2 Kings, the city of Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. The people are being carried away into captivity, and there's a handful of people left. God tells them, do not go to Egypt through the prophet Jeremiah. And they get together and they kill the governor, and then in fear, the last thing we hear is that God's people then are leaving Israel and they're going down into Egypt. And so the events, all the way back to where we are tonight, are going to be written down and taking place all the way toward the end of the Old Testament. We're just going to read some highlights from 1 Kings chapter 1. And we always have people at home who are reading along, so I'll just kind of list the verses. But let's just do kind of a brief summary of the first chapter and notice some of the highlights of what is taking place. First of all, David is in his old age. And notice what the text says. King David was old and advanced in years, and although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. They made a search. They found a beautiful young woman. Her name is, and these names are just tongue twisters, but look at this one, Abishag, the Shunammite, and they brought her to the king. The young woman was very beautiful. She was of service of the king. She attended to him, but the king knew her not. And basically, can I use the term like electric blanket? I mean, she's there basically to keep, he's cold, and he's not able to rest and sleep, and so she's brought in to do that. One of the sons of David is going to be Adonijah. And one of the things that I keep hearing in my mind as I keep reading through this, we go back to the events with David and Bathsheba, and the Lord forgives the sin, but the consequences are the sword will never leave your house because of the killing of Uriah the Hittite. So here's the next son after Absalom. Adonijah exalted himself, 21:5, and he said, I will be king. And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. And again, here's one of these little slivers that tell us a whole lot. David had never at any time displeased him by asking, why have you done this and so? And one of the things we talked about last week, we know of approximately 20 sons by name. We know one daughter by name, and then we see other passages that plural will just say sons and daughters. And every time I read that, the grave injustice is, how much time can David as the king and being the king and doing all the things that he's doing invest in the spirituality of his own children? And so here is Adonijah, and all that we're told is just a little bitty comment, but it also tells us a lot. David had never at any time displeased his son by asking, "Why have you done this or that?" The next part also says a lot as well. He was a very handsome man, and he was born after Absalom. When I was at OC, I don't know if any of you knew Stanley Shipp. He had worked in Switzerland or somewhere in Europe for a while, and then spoke at a lot of youth rallies and things. And he was just, he was enjoyable to listen to. And occasionally he would refer to himself using the terms mud fence and, bald. And there was just nothing, like Jesus, we find in Isaiah 53, there was nothing beauty to desire him. And a couple of times I heard him say, he said, especially, for you girls and guys who are really good looking, he said, I feel sorry for you because you don't know if they really like you or they just like your looks. He said, if you're as ugly as I am, there's no doubt about it. And he would just have this kind of self-defacing comment about that. And you know what I'm saying? We've all seen people who've gotten through life on their looks without being accountable for their actions. And so look at what's about to happen. Absalom, handsome, good-looking guy, huge. I mean, his hair is so big he's going to get caught in the tree and he's going to get killed by that when he's rebelling against the king. And so here's another son who's going to decide, well, rather than waiting for my father to decide who's going to become the king, then I'm going to get people together and I'm going to take that on myself. So we're in 1 Kings 21 and verse 7. Adonijah conferred with Joab, and Joab has kind of been the general, the commander of the troops, Abiathar the priest, and they followed Adonijah and they helped him. So basically, one of the sons is going to take it on himself to appoint himself as the king. He gets some of the leading people together to be on his side, and they're going to have a gathering and get this momentum, and basically is going to declare himself to be the king, and his father hasn't either consented or had anything to do with this. But here's one of these interesting expressions. We're in verse 8, and I just underlined the word but, and notice the contrast. Zadok the priest, Benaniah the son of Jehoiada, and Nathan the prophet. And then when you look, there's a Shimei who had insulted David, had thrown rocks at him when they were leaving Jerusalem, getting away from Absalom. There is also a brother of David whose name is Shimei. But then the writer says David's mighty men were not with Adonijah. So what's going to take place is that one of these 20-plus sons of David, while he's still alive, but now he's very much an old man, is deciding, I'm going to appoint myself king, I'm going to get the right people with me, I'm going to get certain leaders. But he also knows those who are loyal to his father, and he doesn't invite those people to come at all. So he selects a handful of people to help him to become king. Verse 9, Adonijah sacrificed sheep and oxen and fattened cattle, and he invited all of his brothers, the king's sons, and all the royal officials of Judah. And then it lists again the people he didn't invite. So in verse 11, Nathan the prophet says to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, have you not heard that Adonijah has become king and David our Lord does not know it? Now therefore let me give you advice that you may save your life and the life of your son Solomon. And very often in ancient Near Eastern societies, when one became king, then you killed even members of your own household who might be rivals to the throne. And so go into David and you have this conversation with him. Didn't you promise that Solomon would reign after me and sit on the throne? So in verse 14, while you are speaking with the king, I will come in and confirm your words. So Bathsheba goes into the king, and it just says he was very old. And she bowed down, and she said, the king said, what do you desire? So here's verse 17. My Lord, you swore to your servant by the Lord your God, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne. And now behold, Adonijah is king, even though you, my lord, the king, does not know it. And there's other verses where the people are gathering together and they're shouting, long live King Adonijah. But Nathan the prophet, Zadok the priest, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and Solomon has not been invited. And didn't you tell your servants who would sit on the throne after him? So when you come down to verse 28, David says, call Bathsheba in, and she comes in, and his statement in 29 is, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed me out of my soul out of every adversity, as I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, Solomon, your son, shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place, and even so I will do this day. So basically what's going to happen is that those who weren't invited are David's closest loyal friends, and he calls these people together. The expression is they get the king's mule, and Solomon is then going to be brought in, and the priest is going to anoint him, and he is going to be appointed as the king in terms of David, and you'll see that in verse 35. He will be ruler over Israel. I highlighted a group of people at the very bottom of this page, and you see the Cherethites and the Pelethites. We're going to look at some individuals here in a second, and this is just one of those amazing, one of my favorite kind of stories in the Old Testament in the life of David. And when we went through David, we didn't get to touch on this. But there's this group called his mighty men, and I think it's about fourth or fifth down is Benaiah, who we're looking at, but he is over the king's bodyguard. And if you look at these two names, the Cherethites and the Pelethites, most people think, as far as they can tell, these are soldiers from Crete, and they are also some of these soldiers who have some Philistine backgrounds as well. And so this is kind of ironic, but also kind of interesting. David's bodyguard are not Israelites. And so these are guys who, and we'll use this expression, my granddad would talk about a couple of people he knew, and he said, this guy can go bear hunting with a switch. And that's who these guys are. And we've just done a little bit of a summary here in a little bit. These are really strong, tremendous warriors. And Benaiah is not even in the top four. However, he is with this particular group of guys. And so of all things, the bodyguard for King David, can I probably use the word mercenaries? They're people who are paid, but they're not Israelites, and Benaiah is going to be in charge of them, and we'll see what takes place there in just a little bit. So if you look at the next page, we're in chapter 1, verse 39. So Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. They blew the trumpet. The people shouted, long live King Solomon. And all the people went after him, playing the pipes and rejoicing with great joy. And just a little interesting comment, the earth was split by their noise. Great time of rejoicing. So in the meantime, here's all the people with Adonijah, and a messenger comes and says, this is what's taken place. They have the king's mule. David has appointed Solomon to be the king. And the expression is everyone just kind of melts and disappears. So the party's over. So originally they'd come together and they're thinking we're going to be close to the king and he's going to be the next one in control. And then when the word comes that Solomon has been anointed, then all of these people leave and they depart. And Adonijah, and this is in verse 50, feared Solomon. So he arose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar. And there's some other things that are said. And Solomon said, if he will show himself a worthy man, not one of his hairs will fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. So Solomon sent, and they brought him down from the altar, and he came and he paid homage to King Solomon. And Solomon said, go to your house. And there'll be other details that will happen, and this is not going to end well, but we'll save that for another time. What I want to look at, though, for just a little bit are these mighty men, and the biggest description of them is back in 2 Samuel 23. And the term that I use, and I'm thinking initially first even of Jonathan. David had the capacity to just develop a deep sense of loyalty among his friends. And loyalty is a two-way street. But if you notice, from very, very early, then Jonathan is attracted to David, and as King Saul starts trying to hunt him down and he's a man on the run, then all of these people, literally by the hundreds, eventually come, and they come with David, and he protects them, and they protect him, and they work with him. And one of the amazing things was just the capacity that David had to create loyalty among his troops. The irony is that two of his sons rebel against him. And you just kind of shake your head. People who are foreigners, people who are outcast, and people who are soldiers are kind of bound to David. And then first Absalom, and then in his own way, Adonijah, are not loyal and faithful to their father. So here's the first one, and I'm in 2 Samuel 23, verse 8. These are the names of the mighty men whom David had. Okay, I'll do the best I can. Josh Heb Bash Heb Eth, a Techlamite, okay? That's as close as I can get. But look at this. He was the chief of the three, and there's in a continuing verse, he wielded his spear against 800 whom he killed at one time. That's what I'm saying. You talk about mean guys. Here's a guy that with his own spear, by himself, kills 800 people by himself. There's other descriptions, but I just chose one for each of them. So he, in terms of the three, then he's the ringleader of the whole thing. And then next to him was Eliezer, the son of Dodo, the son of Ahoe. And he struck down the Philistines, and there was this field and everything, until his hand was heavy and his hand clung to his sword. He had fought so long and killed so many people, either he or someone had to pry his hand off the sword because it just stuck to the sword, and he was the second one. Next to him was Shammai. He took his stand in the midst of the plot, he defended it, and he struck down the Philistines. And this is my favorite story about David. He made the mistake one day of saying, I wish I had a drink from the well in Bethlehem. And Scripture says at this time the Philistines are in control of Bethlehem. And so what happens? These three guys decide, David would like to have a drink from the well of Bethlehem. Let's go charging into the city and draw some water and get it for him. So can you imagine being the Philistines and here these three guys come charging over the walls or however they get in? I have this picture of two guarding the well, one putting down the thing and getting the water. And it's like, we dare you to come close. And then they climb over the wall and they leave. When you have to wonder, what on earth are they doing? And their commander has says, I wish I had a drink from the well in Bethlehem. And these three guys risk life and everything else, and they go tearing into the city, occupied by Philistines, draw water out. When they bring it out, David, in honor of that, he says, I can't drink this because of the risk, and he pours it out kind of as an offering. Every time I read this, and I'm sorry, this is a farming term, but if they did this when David said, I wish I had a drink, what happened when David said, sick 'em? And just look at that. Here he just kind of casually says, I wish I had a drink from Bethlehem. And these three guys go charging into an enemy city, get water out of the well, bring it back. And then you think, we're going to take this city or we're going to defend this. And these are the three mighty men. Then when you read, and this is 1-2, Abishai, and he's the brother of Joab, he was the chief of the 30. And so you have the three mighty men, and then you have Abishai. And you go through this list. There's 37 of them. And guess who is the last one of the 30 of David's loyal soldiers? Uriah the Hittite. He's deceased at this point. Well, he's going to be deceased because David's going to kill him because he has an affair with his wife. And that's just one of those sobering things that you read through, and here's all these loyal, strong soldiers. And we're going to touch on this later, but let me just say it here. One, we're not always in the class, and I may not always remember. Abraham's about 2,000, and when you go roughly from the Euphrates down toward Egypt, at one time or another, Abraham walks through this land and remembers we said, God said, walk the length of the breadth of it, and I will give it to you. It will be 1,000 years later. In the time of David, then God's people will briefly occupy the land that God promised to Abraham. It will gradually shrink, but God made the promise, and 1,000 years later, God is good for his word. And one of the ways that this was accomplished was through these 3 mighty men, and then the next one is going to be Abishai. Then here's the third one. Here's our guy, Benai, who is not invited to all the other events. He was in command of the Cherethites and the Pelethites. And again, anticipate bodyguard. He struck down 2 aerials, and people aren't quite sure. These may just be 2 major, like, heroes of Moab. He went down to a pit and killed a lion on the day when the snow had fallen. And we've taken small kids to the Oklahoma City Zoo, and the last time it happened, it was just a female lion, but every time she moved, every muscle in her body moved, and I'm just thinking, okay, this is mama, and what would it be like, if it was a male lion? These guys are really, really strong. And then I laugh. Here's 23:21. He struck down an Egyptian, a handsome man. The Egyptian had a spear, and Benaiah went down to him with a staff, snatched the guy's spear away from him, and then kills him with his own spear. So these are the core guys who enabled David to conquer the territory and the things that are there. And when the son, Adonijah, is trying to take over the kingship, then Benaiah is the one that he does not invite. So here's how we're going to finish and summarize tonight. Look at what David does to have Solomon coronated as the king. And when you look at it from the idea of the priesthood, then it's going to be Zodek the priest. And anticipate this, the priest who went with Adonijah is the son of Levi. And God had said earlier that at some point Levi would not have any of his descendants in the priesthood, and he's not going to be killed, but he's going to be removed from the priesthood, and another one of Aaron's sons is going to be brought in. But we have the priest, Zadok the priest. We have Nathan the prophet, so we have God's prophet. And then we have Benai with the Cherethites and the Pelethites, and these guys are the bodyguards. And so you're going to have, physically, the guys to keep Solomon safe, and then you're going to have the blessing of God's prophet who has brought this about by bringing this to David, and then we're going to have the priest, and how appropriate that the priest is going to anoint him with oil. So here's something that just always comes to mind, and we mentioned this on the run, but let's just tie the knot in the thread tonight with this. The first and the last person we meet in the New Testament is David. And over, Jesus is proclaimed as the king of the Jews, or the son of David. But, as we said last week, I just kind of laugh and sometimes shudder. It wasn't a prophet, and it wasn't a priest. Women are the ones who anoint Jesus. And on the one hand, you think, that's not exactly like a priest. That's not like Samuel. But the other side, I think, oh, how appropriate. And even the lady that before he dies, she anticipates this. And what are they saying? If she knew what manner of woman she was, he would not let her touch her. She's unclean. and she anoints the body of Jesus. And of all things, it is women who anoint the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and it is women who are the first ones at his tomb on the first day of the week. And here he is as the spiritual king. That's right. And the transition now is going to be made from David. He will live a little bit longer, and then we'll have the early life of Solomon consolidating the kingdom. And one of the major things that's going to happen, just to anticipate, is literally the building of the temple. And it's going to take 7 years, and David has stored all of this material and all these things together. And as we go through, we'll just want to kind of stop and just look at what was the temple, both in terms of physically and what it meant spiritually in terms of the presence of God among his people. Very good. Thank you very much.